and percent. So like if you're given a percent, how do you make that into a fraction or a decimal, and vice versa? So we're just going to start off by writing one example of each of the following. So write an example of a percent. My example might be like 24%. Okay. A decimal, again, you can pick any number as long as it has a decimal, would be something similar to like 3.28. And then a fraction, again, any kind of fraction, we're talking one number over another, like 7/8. Okay. I'm going to make this pen a little bit thinner so it's easier to see. So to make a percent into a decimal, you move the decimal 2 places to the left. Okay. And in a lot of percents, we don't see decimals. So we have to think like, where is the decimal place located in a percent? Like, let's say we have 89%. There's no decimal in that. So in the number 89, where does the decimal go? Well, if you think back to money, like we were doing yesterday, if it's $89, that decimal would go here, and then we just fill in zeros. So the decimal in a whole number always comes at the end of that right side. So in order to make a percent into a decimal, you have to first put that decimal point in and then move it to the left. You can also think back to yesterday when we used like 89% was equal to 89 cents. So we could also just think about like, how do we write that as cents? Well, that would be 0.89, right? So it's moving it to the left. So 87%, you could think to yourself, how many cents is that? That's 87 cents. So you'd write it as 0.87. Okay. Or you could put that decimal in, move it over twice, you get that 0.87. Then 21%, we'd have 0.21. 35%, we put that decimal in the end, move it over twice, 0.35. And then last but not least, 112%. Again, in like $112, that decimal still comes at the very end. So we still have to first put that decimal in, move it over twice, 1, 2, and this would be 1.12, which makes sense, right? Because 100 cents is $1. So 100% is $1, and we have more than 100%, meaning we're going to have more than $1. Okay, so that's how we make a percent into a decimal. Now to do the opposite, to make a decimal into a percent, we move the decimal 2 places opposite, which is to the right. Now in this situation, we might end up with empty spaces. So we need to remember that what we do if we have like an empty space, like for example, if I've got 5.5 and I'm moving that decimal place over, what I put in that empty space is a 0. Okay. Because 55 is very different than 550. So we need to make sure that we fill in empty spaces with zeros. Okay. When we're starting with a decimal, there's already going to be a decimal in there. So we're no longer putting a decimal at the end. We're taking the decimal we already have and moving it 2 spaces over, which would make this 25%. Same thing here. Don't be fooled. This is not 5% because when we move it over, we have that empty space that we have to put a 0 in. So that would be 50%. Okay. When you're starting at a decimal is always smaller than the percent. So if you're starting at a decimal and making it into a percent, your number should be getting bigger. Whereas if you're starting at a percent and making it into a decimal, the decimal should be always smaller. So we're always making it smaller. That's just one way to check to see if we're doing it right. This would be 5%. Because all those zeros at the front we can drop off. For example, you'd never see the number 5 written like 005. So what I'm doing is I'm dropping off those zeros at the front in order to just write 5. Same thing with 2.10. You just move it over twice. That would be 210%. Okay. So that's how we convert between percents and decimals. Next will be decimals to fractions. So in order to convert a decimal to a fraction, we're going to want to use the place value names, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, to write the fraction and then simplify it. I'm going to show you how to simplify it, but I don't believe on your homework today that you'll have to simplify it. So just always make sure you're reading the directions to see whether you have to simplify that answer or not. So let's just review over our decimal places. Like if we have the number 1.375, this 3 is in the tenths place. The 7 is in the hundredths place. And then this 5 is in the thousandths place. Okay, so it goes tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So when we're reading this decimal using place value, we no longer want to say like 0.25 because that doesn't help us. But we look at what number is in the last number in this problem, which is a 5, and that's in the hundredths place because it's a second place over, and hundreds have 2 zeros. That's why it's a second place over. The thousand place has the number 1,000 has 3 zeros, so it's the third place. 10 only has 1 zero, so that's why it's the first place after the decimal. So this will be 25 hundredths. So we just write that as a fraction, 25 hundredths. And then we would simplify that. Technically, you can divide both those numbers by 25 to get 1/4. This would be 5 tenths because it's in that first decimal place, which is tenths. So 5 tenths. This one is different than this one because this is the 5, which is in the hundredths place. So this is 5 hundredths. So notice how those two are different. This was in the first decimal place, which is tenths. This is in the second one, which is hundredths. And then when we have a number bigger than 1, okay, the 2 is our whole number. So this is going to be a mixed number. So we're going to have like 2 as a whole number. And then we've got 10 hundredths. So 2 and 10 hundredths is how we say that. You could also, since it's zeros at the end, we can drop off. You could also say 2 and 1/10. Though they're the same thing. If you notice, we divide both those by 10. It would simplify to 2 and 1/10. So both of those are correct, however you want to find that. All right, so that was decimals to fractions. Now let's do fractions to decimals. And there's 2 different ways we can do fractions and decimals, so I will show you both methods. We are going to divide the numerator or denominator using division, which you can use a calculator in this unit, so you don't have to use long division. You can use a calculator. Or rewrite an equivalent fraction, an equal fraction, with a denominator, bottom number of 10, 100, or 1,000. And we'll see how this works. Okay, so for this first one, let's do it with the equivalent fraction. So we've got 1/25. And for percent, it's really easy in order to get it to be out of 100. So if I'm going from 25 to 100, think of how many quarters fit into 100. That would be 4. I would do the same thing on top. 4, we'd read this out using like a fraction. So this would be 4 hundredths. So now I'm going to write that decimal as 4 hundredths. Hundredths is the second place after the decimal. So 4 hundredths would be the decimal for that. Okay. Now I think the easier way to do it is with division. Remember, a fraction bar equals division. So a fraction bar equals division. So the first thing I think to do, just so you don't end up putting the numbers in wrong in the calculator, is rewrite that problem with the division sign. So now in a calculator, we take 4 divided by 5. Make sure we don't switch those numbers and do 5 divided by 4 because you will get the wrong answer. 4 divided by 5, in that calculator, we'd get 0.8. And that's our decimal. So I think that that's the easiest way to do it. 3 divided by 4, or 3/4, is equal to, and you put that in your calculator, 3 divided by 4, 0.75. Okay. All right. Fractions to percents. So if we are starting at a fraction and we want to make it a percent, you can write an equal fraction. So the denominator is 100. And then whatever number's on top. For example, if I have like 37 over 100, that equals 37% because percent is out of 100. So whatever number on top would be our percent then. So if I have 125, 1/25, which I did on the top up here, I know I could do times 4 to get it to be out of 100. Times 4 times 4, which is 4/100, which is equal to 4%. Okay, let's do another one like that. 4 over 50. I know 50 is easy to get to 100, which is why I think that this method is easy for this one. We do times 2. On the top, we do the same thing, times 2, and we get 8 over 100, which is equal to 8%. These last two, again, we can use that division. So I'll show you how to do it that way as well. We'd do 3 divided by 4, which we already have up here is 0.75. And now that we have a decimal, we know how to convert that to a percent by just moving it over twice to 75%. Same thing here. We could do 2 divided by 5 to get the decimal of 0.4. And then move it over twice. Oh, I'm not sure what that is. Hang on. Okay, we'll just leave that. Move the decimal over twice, fill in your empty space with a 0, and that would be 40%. Okay. There we go. Last but not least, now we did fractions to percents. We want to do percents to fractions, so doing the backwards of what we just did. So first thing I want to ask is, what is percent out of? Like, what is the highest percent you can get without going over? Okay, because you can technically go over this number, like think about a test with extra credit. But percent is out of 100. Okay, so to write a percent as a fraction is super simple because you just write the percent over 100. And then if the directions say to simplify, you should. If they say you do not need to simplify, you can just leave it. For example, 75% is 75 over 100. That's it. If the directions say to simplify, both those numbers could be divided by 25, which would be equal to 3/4. 20% would be 20 over 100. Technically, both those numbers could be divided by 20, which would give you 1/5 if the directions say to simplify. But if they don't, you can leave it. 85% would be 85 over 100. Technically, both those could be divided by 5 to simplify. Last but not least, we'd have 14%. Would be 14 over 100. Technically, you could divide both those by 2 to get 7 over 50 as well. Okay, so that is how you convert between all those different types of numbers. This is a huge skill that you will use every other year that you are in math class. So just make sure that we have this skill mastered is really important.